Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that report by Joswinen, and I'm delighted to present a few remarks today. This report talks about a few topics that are really of keen interest to me, and one of those is sort of looking at income shocks. And as someone who's got their PhD in political economy, I find it's really interesting how Yo traces out what kind of leads to, how negative shocks can often lead to policy changes that are really important. There are two points that I wanted to make. One, that I feel that it's really important that we look at the gendered impacts of income shocks. And number two, I think it's really important to look at the psychological impacts of income shocks. So I want to speak a little bit to those 2 points today, and maybe it can provide some food for thought, no pun intended, for the report going forward. Now, as far as the gendered impacts, I've been doing research here with colleagues at IFPRI looking at using data, an 11-year panel of data from Kyrgyzstan, and looking at how income shocks affect households. And one of the things we find that's not surprising is negative shocks to household income are resulting in migration. They're resulting in more male migration than they're resulting in female migration. And we're finding that that's resulting in households in which female headship is becoming increasingly common, but you're also seeing higher dependency ratios in those households. You're seeing more remittances coming into those households. And so really kind of understanding and examining the confluence of all of these factors is really critical to understand how income shocks affect women. We're finding negative income shocks are leading to outmigration by men, but remittances that are coming in are not actually compensating for a lot of the lost income for household. So severe deteriorations in child nutrition and health outcomes, subjective well-being for women is deteriorating. So it's really important to kind of understand these outcomes. We know that when men migrate, often women have new labor market opportunities, but they can also see a reduction or they can have areas in which women are sort of shut out still, so households cannot avail of certain opportunities like access to irrigation. So very important to understand that aspect. Second is the psychological impacts. And there's really two separate psychological impacts that I think are really important about negative shocks. The first of these is negative impacts on aspirations. I presented some research yesterday looking at the impacts of aspirations on women's empowerment. And we have higher aspirations, we have more empowered women. Lots of my colleagues and myself at IFPRI have done research looking at how aspirations are very important because they lead to investments in technologies, they lead to savings, they lead to forward-looking investments in your children's education. We know aspirations are important, but my work has showed that negative income shocks and negative natural disasters, for example, can wipe out aspirations for the future. And so this is where I've got research also showing that when you have effective social protection programs that combat the negative impacts of these shocks, you actually do not observe these reductions in aspirations following a negative shock. So social protection is important here for the negative aspirational impacts of shocks. Another psychological dimension is the negative effect of shocks on confidence in government. Confidence and trust in government is critical for citizens to be engaged, to vote, to not support extremist elements that are often providing an alternative to the public sector. So we really need to understand how to combat this. And I've got research in Pakistan showing that individuals dealing with plausibly exogenous shocks to their income are increasingly angry with government and they do not support their government. But when we look at exogenous access to a social protection program, doing some analysis with people above and below a poverty score who do and do not get a social protection program, we actually find that all these negative feelings are wiped out when they get social protection. So just wanted to point out, I think shocks are important, and I'm really glad this report has kind of put our fingers on the pulse of this, but I think it's also important to look at the gendered and psychological impacts of shocks. Thank you.